Welcome to this new podcast episode. Today I'm talking to Julia Tew. Am I saying that right, Julia?
You are. Thank
Thank
you,
you.
Erno. Am I saying your name right?
Yes, you are. Thank you.
Good. Good.
So we've met um, through the IDG, the Inner Development Goals practitioners meetings, and through LinkedIn, right? I see your messages on LinkedIn and I like what you say there. So I thought, okay, this is going to be interesting to talk with her to learn how she's doing things. And while I was researching you, I also learned a lot of other things, but I think, oh, that's interesting to talk about. um, let's start with what you're doing with the IDGs, because you have started together with a couple of people, the IDG South Africa Consultants Hub. Why did you start a consultants hub and not just a hub in general?
That's a good question. And it's not yet, I guess, set in stone. So because, as I said, it was emerging in terms of where our main focus would be, we also set up a group on LinkedIn, which is our favorite platform. And that is a little bit more broad, and that is focused on Southern Africa. And that is simply for anyone who's interested in the IDGs, but within our sort of local context. And that's actually where most of our action is taking place and our networking and posting. So why consultants and coaches and things? I think we realized in the practitioners meeting and even in the word practitioners meetings, the IDGs are being spread, I think, largely by practitioners like yourself and myself who've taken on a role or who have a professional role of teaching and coaching and supporting and bringing new ideas and concepts through to their audiences and their clients. So I think, and this was Colleen, who's now a good friend of mine, but the two of us came up with a consultants idea, but realizing that there's a very strong movement of people who utilize the tools that they have. You and I were chatting earlier about some of your tools like habit forming. And that's why we felt there's a very strong drive to educate practitioners, coaches, and consultants around the IDGs to help because as you and I chatted about earlier, it's not so much about the what they are, but it's about how do we apply them. And often that's where you need the intermediary of the coach or the consultant to introduce ways of applying the IDGs. And they're a critical piece in that ecosystem, a critical player in that ecosystem. And as you know, I'm all about systems and ecosystems.
We'll get to that and all a lot of from what you did in the career and so on. But I'm also still let's continue with the IDGs because I'm
Mm-hmm.
interested because um, when I first heard about the IDGs, the inner development goals, it was for me, it was really it clicked really soon and really fast, right? So the foundation is the SDGs. It's broad. So again, the question: how was there a lot? How do companies do this? It's now within the Netherlands with the governments, the local governments. They need to do it. They need to work with this. But still, with companies, small companies, you don't see it yet. And also, they have questions: how do we do this? And when I talk about the IDGs in like a workshop or somewhere where I'm at, it clicks really fast when I talk about. So this is difficult, the SDGs, and if you look at how you could start working within your company, you could start with working with the inner development of your people.
Mm.
They say yes, I think that's what we are missing, and how could we do this? And but then it is based on a framework that was built, and the idea came from Sweden, from a couple of people in Sweden, and it was also then designed these 23 skills with experts from all over the world, well, mostly the Western world. And you live in South Africa, right? So how do you and how do people in Africa experience the IDGs? Is it a platform that is working for Africa, or is it do you feel it's difficult because it's Western? How do you see this?
Yeah, you bring up a very good point, and that definitely does come up. It's almost one of the first things we bring up when we do have conversations with groups here in South Africa and Southern Africa, is the fact that we understand and we acknowledge that it was developed and conceptualized in the global north, and that in many cases it's the global south that is suffering even more from the crises that are going on at the moment, many of which I guess were worsened by the global north. So we make it pretty clear that the reason we're so strongly Southern African based is we have different challenges. We have different approaches culturally. We have well established concepts around things like Ubuntu and us together, and what affects one of us affects all of us. And we're also dealing with a lot of trauma here in South Africa. I don't think I need to explain to you the kind of trauma that exists, which I guess does exist obviously in other parts of the world, but ours is pretty significant. And so I think the people we bring together, and in many cases they happen to be practitioners, they are coaches, and they are consultants, and many of them in their line of work deal with things like trauma, and burnout. I think burnout's quite global. But we try our best to work with the dimensions and the skills with very much an African lens. And it's not always, it's certainly by no means perfect. It emerges, and we don't have a diverse enough voice in our group yet on LinkedIn. And we haven't gone there. We haven't had those difficult conversations yet. I have watched a few videos. There was one, I'm not sure if you watched it, about adding forgiveness potentially. That came from very much an African perspective. I'm sure you can track it down. But it was set up more in Northern Africa, I think with the Tutsis and the Hutus, and forgive me if I get my context wrong, but where there's been massive ethnic cleansing. And people involved in that and dealing with the aftermath of that felt that in applying the IDGs, things like forgiveness should potentially be considered to be included. So I think these are all valuable conversations to be had. And I'm hoping that within our group, which is quite small at the moment, but we've got some fantastic people and thinkers and change makers, we do need to develop the skills and the resources to keep it quite Africa focused, and make it relevant for the local context, because without local relevance, it's irrelevant. And it can contribute to existing hurt that comes from the heritage that we've got in places of Africa of colonialism and extraction and domination. So it's really it's quite a sensitive topic, and so we have, and I'm right in there. I'm a white privileged person here in South Africa, so I already have to watch myself and check the context that I'm coming from.
And still, you started working with the IDGs because you see it as a great framework. Um, what is, and it's this, I'm just asking you, so not as representing, but just you, right? So what do you think one of the skills, or maybe one of the domains, which you feel isn't quite right at the moment for Southern Africa or Africa in general?
Um, well, I think they're all relatively generic to a large extent. I don't think any of them are particularly exclusionary or too specific to one culture. I mean, I have a printout in front of me. I keep them here, and so I can look at them now as my little cheat sheet. Um, and looking at this, I don't think that any of them are exclusionary in terms of other cultures. Let me have a look here. Mobilization skills. No, I mean, I think that, but I think the interpretation thereof is key. So we in South Africa or in Africa need to be bringing in older, more indigenous perspectives into these. That's the key. Because how Africans perceive certain things can be radically different to how, say, a Westerner or a global North person would. So, the concept of time in Africa in its essence is different to how us sort of first world people conceptualize time or history, or so it might not be here, but it's also one has to be very culturally sensitive. So I can't pick one in particular.
Hmm.
Long-term orientation in Africa, that's not always part of the culture, for example. Some people will say, oh, yeah, mañana, mañana, tomorrow, tomorrow. Um, let's focus on today. We're in today, let's look at today, and what happens tomorrow is another story. And I'm generalizing here that, there might just be, a view of certain people in certain areas. But so, in our Western society, we're focused on goals and time and routine and, a lot of structure. And that's not always the way that things are approached in Africa. Sometimes it is, but it isn't always. So again, we need to be careful about, and I'm not even aware of some of these things. So it's my job to say, how do you, as an indigenous person in Africa, view something like courage? We see it one way, but do you see it some other way? And maybe they view courage in a completely different way than we do. And it's our job to make sure that we bring those voices in. Otherwise, it's meaningless to them. You're trying to insert your views and your values on somebody else. And I take this approach with anything, even in the corporate world. Um, so many people have things in a way shoved down their throats because you're not listening to what it means to them. Story of our lives. I think that's why we're in such a sticky situation now. The same applies to the IDGs, but I can't, inner reflectiveness, inner compass, that's not always necessarily a strong feature in the African culture, perhaps. That's one we need to, going inwards and becoming mindful. These are words that are very much Western and global North. Mindfulness, I don't think it relates as much. So I think we need to be careful and maybe approach it from more of a community perspective. The community is very strong often in Africa, and it's the voice of the elders, perhaps. That's kind of missing here, is where are the wise voices of our ancestors? They speak to us. We have to give them respect and we have to listen to them. So, again, we just have to adapt.
How do you use it in combination with Ubuntu?
Um, Well, I love Ubuntu, and I probably don't use it enough, but if I were to translate Ubuntu into a word that is, I guess, more Western, it would be collective consciousness. Um, and understanding that what happens to me happens to us. And I love it, but the concept of Ubuntu you'll find is there probably in many or most indigenous cultures. Um, so it's including all the stakeholders because they are an integral part of the system, whether you see it or not. But therein lies the strength of the ecosystem, is that coherence, working together, listening to each other, working with each other's strengths, building each other up where there are weaknesses, etc. So I think that I would like to think that I apply that in, when we do work within any organization or community, one has to apply that Ubuntu, which technically I guess is systems thinking and reconnecting to the whole. We've gone that mechanistic route of thinking that things are mechanized and separate. And you listen to any of our great thinkers today and in our current context, and I mentioned Daniel Christian Wall and any of the other great thinkers. It's that disconnect from the whole that's gotten us into this mess, and not realizing that, what happens to you is probably going to end up affecting me. And we can't assume that they're all just externalities. We're all part of that, and there will be consequences for all of us if we start messing around with our natural resources or our social well-being. Um, and I'm sure most of what I'm saying is very, very familiar to you, but it's not showing in the practices that we're seeing in the world at the moment. So we need more Ubuntu, or whatever you call it, and whatever your culture is. Um, yeah.
How do you integrate it in your life?
In my life, um, I'm learning to become a better listener, for sure, because I'm in communications. As you might pick up in this interview, I can talk. I love to talk. I love conversations, and I can talk endlessly. And for some that's a skill. But I think an even better skill is being able to truly listen to what others are saying. And if there's a silence there, why isn't that voice being heard? And I think your parenting is a great example, and I need a lot more work there in terms of listening to one's children and listening to the younger generation. And I consider myself relatively open-minded, and yet when it comes to parenting, a lot of us default to what we experienced with our own parents in older generations. And we swore before we became parents, I will never become like my parents. I'm never going to be that narrow-minded, and I'm never going to be that strict, and I'm never going, I'm going to be such a new age, enlightened parent. I don't know if you've got kids, I don't know.
I do.
But that's certainly an area where I am trying to work very hard on my listening skills and understanding and relating. Um, and here in South Africa, yeah, I need to get over my fears and engage more with the real South Africa, where the problems are. And this is where it starts getting quite challenging, because we live in our suburbs behind our electric fences, with our private security companies driving up and down. It's a horrendous situation, and the haves want to protect what they have, and then there in the townships are the have-nots living in squalor with nothing. um, and if I'm going to be authentic, that's where I should be trying to do the work, and to get involved, and to get my hands in there, in the soil, and start at grassroots level. And that's extremely challenging. As a white woman, I'm too scared to go into those communities, as welcoming and lovely as I imagine the majority of them are. But we also have one of the highest crime levels in the world, and you can't be stupid and naive and wander into a very dangerous, potentially dangerous situation. So yeah, that weighs heavily on the mind. Am I actually being authentic? Am I leaving out those voices in our country that need the most help? And so I do get involved with NGOs who do work in those communities, and they are probably better equipped to work in those communities because it's authentic. They've got people that they relate to and that look like them. Um, but there's also got to be something that I can do that's not too, again, privileged, and yeah, it's a balance. It really is. Our government, you don't want to get involved with the government, because there's so much corruption and mismanagement there, that it puts off people like myself or NGOs working with the government to then, the Western Cape is probably a better example. They're doing a lot of good in the Western Cape because their government there is functioning quite successfully. But here, yeah, so these are the challenges we deal with here in South Africa.
While you were talking about these separate worlds,
Mm.
I was thinking that probably in the areas where you um, live um, I'm not finding the right word, but commute. Let's say you move around. That was what I'm looking for. Um, Probably these people need these inner development goals, right? To learn to, or even Ubuntu more, right? To learn that it's impossible to build a community, a nation, a world where there's still a separation of them and us, right? As long as you still think in they are doing it and we do this, um, I think that's going to be very difficult to build a sustainable world. To why the IDGs actually have been created, right? So that we have the skills, we create skills, not these skills, but skills that help us to think about, work on, feel, develop ourselves into human beings um, that really can think, feel, live a new world,
Yes.
and have the courage, for example, to one of the things I'm sorry, I'm thinking
I can see that.
one of the things I've been learning an interesting question and also a difficult question is what is my enough, right? So when do I have enough? And as an entrepreneur, it's even more difficult, right? So if you're an employee, right, you have a certain set of money that you get every month, you get a paycheck, and you can think, okay, so this is my enough. But if you're an employee, if you're an entrepreneur, you try to build and grow a company. Most of us do. When is it enough? How many people do you need? What's your revenue? What's your profit that you really need? When is it enough? That's the first question. Then the second question is even more important and more difficult to answer. What will you do when you get to that point? So, for example, you say, I'm going to build a company, I'm going to grow my company. My enough is 10 employees, right? So, usually that's around $1 million, dollars, euros, whatever, right? So, that's usually around that number somewhere. So, let's say 10 employees, that's my enough. That's if I grow to that size, I'm really content. I can have an impact with my company. I can really do something in the world with what I'm doing, in my community, whatever. But what will you do when you get to that number 10? How will you change your business to not continue to grow? Because what normally happens is when you're at 10, oh yeah, I need two more now because I see now these and these jobs and these opportunities. So I need two more. So the enough will just shift normally. That's how right now the economy works, right? So we always need more. So talking about courage, I think this is something, especially in the Western world, we should think about is, and then again, of course, I go into ours, we and them, but still, what is our enough in the Western world so that we together as a whole can have a world where everybody can live in a sustainable way and in a way that we all feel well-being, right? So we all feel that we have a good life. I also was thinking about this in Africa. Ghana is one of the countries that has embraced the SDGs and the IDGs. Why do you? I'm not aware a lot about Ghana's economy and culture. I'm not sure if you are more about that than I do, but let's see. So, why do you think that Ghana is just doing this great job right now?
That's a great question, and I do believe very strongly in exploring case studies and seeing where are we making progress, and why and how is that happening, and let's explore that. So I'm all for that, and I believe nothing's new under the sun. So they must be applying some kind of successful strategies, but I imagine that they are appropriate for their local context. So a lot obviously starts at the top with government and policy. I don't know Ghana specifically, but I do know, for example, that a friend of mine who's in the sort of training sector traveled to Ghana not long ago and went into training there for, I think, a week. And she showed me some photographs and whatnot, and it certainly appeared to be super organized and sort of very corporate and again I might sound like I'm coming from the wrong space here. Why wouldn't it be? But I think a lot of what happens in Africa goes unnoticed, but there is so much happening in that. Well, it's not even an undercurrent. It's happening in the day to day, but the rest of the world just couldn't be bothered to notice. It's darkest Africa, and it's viewed with this terribly colonial lens. And yet there are some amazing things happening in Africa, in those countries where their government has their act together. I think in many cases, your government can make or break what's going on. We know, for example, that Costa Rica, and I'm jumping, but in the IDGs that Costa Rica is stepping up and showing, but their government is adopting the IDGs and they're sitting in on our meetings, and it's really inspirational stuff when the rest of the world just seems oblivious. So I think if we were to scratch the surface, and unfortunately this is where a lot of the global north or the Western countries couldn't be bothered. They've written Africa off in many cases, or it's just they don't want to go there. There's a lot of awesome stuff happening in Africa. And you look in the green economy, I don't like that term, the green economy, but you look at what's happening in terms of technologies like alternative energy, and things that they're doing with waste, or just really inspiring things that they're learning to do with local crops or whatever it may be. There's great stuff coming out of Africa. You just have to look and see it. And there's also some pretty dodgy stuff as well. So, I mean, but Ghana, I think, is certainly a case study we need to look at and see who are the leaders in place. What are they doing differently? What kind of policies have they introduced? And how can we get more of that? How can we share those stories more? Because Africa gets the bum end of the deal every time. You look on LinkedIn, if you're lucky, every now and then you'll see a few stories about Africa, but it's often quite patronizing. And there's stuff happening at grassroots level, at a community level, at an individual level. There's great social innovation happening, which is super important. And then on the really high tech front, look in South Africa here, what's happening with the cultured meat sector. We've got some brilliant companies. I, off the top of my head, can't think of the name, but I will just now maybe, developing cultured meat technology that is, cutting edge. And yet, unless you happen to be connected into a network that's talking about it, people don't know about it. So I think it's Africa's time. And as the executive director of the NGO that I'm working with, as she said, the giant is awaking. Um, and speaking of LinkedIn, I don't know if you follow. I'm going to forget his name, but he posts a lot about Mauritius. I think he's based in Mauritius. I'll think of his name. And he posted a post the other day about Africa and the size of Africa relative to the other continents. And inside the African continent, you've got the US, and you've got China, and you've got Japan, and you've got most of Europe. And it was blowing people's minds. They were saying, no, surely, really, really, this is how big Africa is. And it's because we live with this flattened map that makes Greenland look almost bigger than Africa. And in fact, Africa is 13 times bigger than Greenland. But people love this skewed view of what Africa is, because if it's smaller and it's more manageable and we don't go there. Yeah, I think it's Africa's time, and also as we bring in digital technology with the fourth industrial revolution, which I know a lot of people are really working quite strongly on to connect Africa to the internet and the World Wide Web. That I think is revolutionizing Africa because it's opening Africa's eyes to what's going on in the rest of the world. And that's a huge learning curve that they can then go on, and giving them access to platforms, technologies, apps that they never even thought were possible. So it's now question Africa the same resources and the same opportunities and the same advantages that the rest of the world has had now for so long. You'd see Africa would be a formidable force. It's not just China, it's not just the US. I think Africa's time is coming.
I've been watching a couple of documentaries about Africa, and I feel it too. I think it's the fastest growing nation. Um, it has the biggest potential to grow in the future. Other nations are just shrinking right now. Um, and I would say um, Africa has a great opportunity to learn from what went wrong in the Western world, what got us in trouble. Um, so I think if we talk about degrowth, for example, it's very difficult to understand from the southern hemisphere, right? So the southern countries, because they don't want to degrowth; they will grow. Of course, they should, right? So, but um, if we all have the same mentality, um, individualistic, difficult word, individualistic point of view on the world, and you all want more all the time, we can see where we're headed. So we've got some great examples now where we're heading. See, for example, in America, GDP is still growing and people are just getting unhappier. So we can see that if you endlessly want to grow GDP, that's not the way to go because it just doesn't make you happier. So there's good examples now that we can see together that we can learn. And that means that in the Western world, we need to just degrow so that there's more space to grow on other parts of the world. Because you just touched on colonialism, extraction, and domination, and I think it's weird to believe in the Western world that we can get products from anywhere in the world to let other people work for like a tenth of the pay that we want to have. Like anything that I think as an individual, right? If you as a parent, let's put it that way. As a parent, anything that you don't want your kids to do, right? I think you don't want anybody to do, right? So that's how I look at it. So if you don't want your kid to work for like $1 a day, don't force it on other people in the world, right? So why should you, if you don't want your kids to do it or yourself, don't push other people into that direction because you just want more. And I think that makes it to me always very clear if you look at it that way. If you don't want to do it, if you don't want your kids to do it, don't try other people to force in that same situation.
It's double standards. And I think that's something that I had to fight in myself quite a long time ago in order to have some kind of authenticity in the route that I've chosen for my life. And I wish that for everybody else, not that I'm by any means perfect, but I think once you start making the right decisions for the right reasons or more appropriate planet-friendly decisions, I hope that people start feeling inside them that those things that they do in their lives that are not planet friendly or future friendly, they start to clash, and they start to realize the cognitive dissonance in their decisions. That you can't hope and want and promote something for, say, your own life and your own children, and not then want that for everybody else. Um, if you do, then you're dealing with some serious cognitive dissonance. And unfortunately, though, in my own community and the community I see at large, it's it's everywhere. And for me, that's why I chose to go vegan, is that I don't like suffering. I don't like people suffering. I certainly don't want my kids to suffer. I don't enjoy suffering myself, but I sure as hell don't want to inflict suffering on anything else. We've all got pets. None of us like to see our pets suffering. I know families that spend tens of thousands of rands to do surgery on their dear sweet doggy, um, so that they don't suffer anymore from some terrible affliction. And I get it, because they love those animals. And yet they could happily, and they do inflict suffering on billions of other sentient animals every single day. And I know I'm getting into a very sensitive topic here, but I personally couldn't live with that, which is why I went the route that I go. And the same goes for human beings, I think. And it's again very woo. I am quite empathetic. I'm a bit of an empath, and so I tend to feel other people's suffering quite intensely, which is why I drive around with bags of peanuts in my car. And then there are homeless people at every intersection that you get to, at every set of lights. And I'm constantly opening my window and handing out peanuts and raisins to the homeless people on the side of the street, because I just can't bear the thought of people going hungry. I don't like my children going hungry. I hate being hungry. And so I think if people simply just applied the same rules and principles, we're going down to, I mean, there's even a name for it. It's called the golden principle or the golden rule. Um, if we just started teaching our children that, do do unto others as you'd like to have done to yourself. So sometimes you can distill it down to something that basic, and I know I sound puerile perhaps, or idealistic, but that's what it is. And so yeah, living standards. You have to allow Africa to want to bring up their living standards to something that is acceptable and comfortable. You can't expect the majority of Africa to be living in poverty and living in the dust and the dirt and the pollution. And yes, for that, there has to be a rebalancing. People don't like it, and it doesn't go down well at all. And I see a lot of the previously disadvantaged communities in South Africa not wanting to just get to sufficiency and we're okay. What is enough? We've got enough. We've got a roof over our head. No, all they see on social media are the influencers. They're the Kardashians. It's the people driving fancy cars and wearing absolute designer labels and the finest jewelry and the best glasses. That's what they want, because that's what they've been fed by the global north on social media. So in fact, they don't want to stop at sufficiency. They want the luxury and the brands and the coolness and the trendiness. And that's what I'm seeing. And it's a really interesting thing to watch here in South Africa, because now the haves, and many of them are people of color, and absolutely, it's what it should be. But they're striving for more and more, and they're getting wealthier and wealthier, and they shop at only the most expensive imported stores, etc. And that's not doing much for the inequality in South Africa. Our Gini coefficient gets worse and worse. And you can't really, you can't blame these people for wanting what the West has had for decades. It's not great for the planet. It isn't. And it's not helping the poorest of the poor in South Africa. But we've got this terrible history that we're trying to rectify. And the scales are going to tip up and down for a while until things settle, if they ever settle, which I I'd like to think that they will, and that's what I'm fighting for, is to create, co-create that new future. Our old systems are so broken, and now we're getting into the territory of Daniel Christian Wall, and regeneration is is not glorifying those old systems of commercialism and consumerism and patriarchal blah 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 blah, but to create a whole new something that people can get excited about. That's what I'm interested in being part of, because the rest, I think, is heading towards a bit of an unraveling, as we've heard the term being used, a great unraveling.
Is that also why you've been involved or are being involved with the 4-day week?
Yes, as I think I mentioned to you personally earlier, I am a bit of a chameleon, or I get myself involved in a wide range of different movements and communities, often out of curiosity, to see what potential they hold, or if it resonates with me and I'm wanting to learn more. Hence my involvement in the IDGs. I came across it. I was like, that I can get my teeth into, and I signed up to be part of it, right? And the 4-day week, I was approached. Somebody had obviously also been, I don't know, following my crazy things on LinkedIn, and approached me and said, we're doing this pilot program. We're actually approaching a number of entrepreneurs, which is very different. I think we're the very first cohort in the world that have got participants who are entrepreneurs and not just sort of medium to big corporates. So we've got this really cool collective of solopreneurs participating in this pilot. And many of us are, again, practitioners. We are consultants and coaches. And our participation in the 4-day week is, again, quite unique because we're participating in it. Many of us have already adopted quite a flexible approach to work, which you have the luxury of doing when you work for yourself. And I'm sure you know this, Erno, very well. So we already, in many ways, were practitioners of the 4-day week in a very loose sense, but we wanted to know more about it. We wanted to know, how does this work? What does it look like? We get to sit in on the conversations with the corporates and how it's been for them, what their experience has been to actually implement it, which takes huge courage. And I salute those who are involved in the pilot, where they now have to try and implement new schedules and work through the teething problems of, are we going to make this work? Eesh, it's difficult. What do our clients think? And it's really been a real journey for them. And as I say, I salute them. But for us, I guess the benefit is that we learn from those learnings. And when we then go out into the world as practitioners, we can not only apply the theory of a reduced work week in our own lives and with our own practices, but we can share those learnings with clients, so that they can understand what the commitments are. How limiting is it? How broad is it? Can we play around with it? The principles, they don't have to be formally the 4-day week. You can apply similar principles in your organization because you're wanting to create a more well-being supportive workplace. You don't need any fancy terminology to do that. But I think the joy for those of us who are part of the pilot program is we're getting these insights. There's research being done, so that there are numerous academic institutions involved. We do surveys, we give our feedback, and they learn from it, and then they publish those results at the end of our pilot program, which is coming up now at the end of August. So then those results are shared with the world, and the world gets to see, wow, it actually does work, but these are the potential pitfalls, or, these are the areas that really benefited from it. But yes, I am a complete supporter of creating a more sustainable, psychologically safe, resilient workplace. And if it looks like the 4-day week, great. A lot of people like a brand. They like a formula to apply. They like to be part of a bigger thing. It's also easier to get people enthused about something that has a little bit of social media wow, and it's quite viral, it's quite trendy. And so that's great. If that's what it takes to get your foot in the door, that's great. But I gave a presentation the other day to the beauty industry. Every now and then I get invited to chat to them. And this one was on the future of the workplace. And it speaks to what you were talking about earlier, Erno, about how do we look at work in a more sustainable way and how much is enough. Um, and the presentation that I gave said that we are moving away from this very much structured role-based way of recruiting and running a company and working more towards a skills-based approach where your practitioners or your the people who do the work are not always employees. They could be consultants, they could be, temporary workers who come in to do project-based work. And like anything, the world of work is evolving thanks to COVID to a large extent, because that made work from home or flexible work or the sort of dual approach far more mainstream than it would otherwise ever have been. Um, but there's a lot of change that needs to happen around the concept of work in general. And this mad, crazy drive that everybody seems to be on to earn enough money to get by. It seems everybody is stressed out about it. Everyone you speak to is like just chasing their tails. They're on this treadmill that never ends. People are burnt out. They're stressed. There's suicide rates going up, etc. And I think there's something inherently quite unsustainable about work in general, in many, many cases. It's the hierarchies. It's still the very patriarchal setup of a lot of workplaces, which is why I would never want to run a company other than being a sole proprietor. That's why I do what I do. Over the years, when the workload has gotten quite hectic, I have occasionally maybe hired someone, but I'm a firm believer in collaborating with other people and sharing the workload in that sense, rather than having people come on board. That's just me. I get it. But the future of work will look very different, I hope. And it's not going to look like it does now necessarily. And the younger generations are pushing back. I don't know how much you've read about it, but the Gen Zs, which everybody likes to disparage and say, oh, they've got such a terrible work ethic. I can't work with these youngsters that are coming in, and it's such a mission, and HR hates them. And I get it. I get it. It's because they're challenging the existing paradigms, and nobody likes that, especially not employers and definitely not HR. But like everything else, we need to revisit the economy and look at degrowth, and we need to revisit the world of work. And I'm a firm believer, like Erin is, in the universal basic income. I am. I definitely am. I think if you could take off that insane pressure that everyone is under to just pay their bills and keep their families fed and educated and housed and whatever, I think it would just take a huge amount of pressure. And people can still work by all means, but we need to be looking at different models. And, again, I'm a bit of a revolutionary, so I'm all for shaking things up. And I know that does make some people very uncomfortable. I get it.
Well, I like the book, which is pretty old now,
Mm,
Elephant and the Flea by Charles Handy, which exactly talks about the things you were talking about before. Like you have the corporate and you have the independents who just go in and go out.
mm.
And in the Gen Z, I was just talking yesterday to Miro, and she's all about a different way of learning outside of school. And I think if you, as an HR department, especially as an HR department, which is a weird name anyway,
Mm.
um, a great way to start would be just asking them questions. So, how do you want to work? How do you want to live? How do you feel that work should look like? So that you can learn what you could do to become like the company of the future and where people really want to work because it's a great place to work. A friend of
Mm.
mine has a company. They have four partners. They have like 30, no, 50 people, I believe now. And they have the golden rule in place. That's the only rule in the company that they have. They have their working contract is 1 page.
Mm-hmm.
That's it, no more, just 1 page. That's
Mm-hmm.
it. And so it's all about making it easy for people to agree to work, make their own decisions, give them, autonomy. I think it's yeah, for me, it is the difference is if you compare it to I I'm a firm believer in the difference between Anglo-American culture and Rhinelandic culture. So Rhinelandic is the countries around along the Rhine, and so they're more like family companies.
Mm.
They have like different ways of thinking because they believe that the company is owned by the company and it's been passed on in the family. So it has long-term thinking as a foundation because I have to pass on this company to future generations.
Mm.
So I'm building
Yes.
something not just because I need the profit now, because I want to make sure that the company continues for the next generations.
Mm.
And what you do is you build craftsmanships within people, right? So you train, you educate them so that they become really crafted people and
Mm.
really understand what they're doing. And if you have crafted people, if you have people who have really craftsmanship, you can trust them. You don't have to, um, you know,
Micromanage them.
yeah, no, it's not really necessary because they know what they're doing and you can let them
Mm.
go because actually you don't know what they're actually doing because they are so well in their work, so good at their work. And
Mm.
you are not. So they know better what to do than you do, right? So and if you are in this company, if you're a manager, you probably come from the floor. So you also know a lot about the technology or the things that they are doing and not like an MBA who just flies in and just flies out, right? Was it the pigeons? Is it they come in and shit everywhere and then fly out again?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
um, so I'm really all about that. The one thing that I wasn't quite sure if I understand it right. So
Mm.
it's 4 day, so it's 80% of the time,
Mm-hmm.
but it's 100% pay.
Yes. At
Why?
100% of the productivity.
I get that last part, but why 100% of the pay?
Well, because if it weren't for that, then I don't think the model would work because the aim is to rethink the workplace on many different levels to make it more of an environment that supports well-being, people being at their best, and then productivity. So I'm sure if you go into any company and you say, are you guys 100% productive 100% of the time? Show me a company that says that, well, they're lying because we all know that companies never work at 100% productivity level, despite whatever rules they might have in place. And there are inefficiencies, and there are people who are off sick, or people who have done a bit of quiet quitting and they're working at their lowest possible productivity to not get fired because they're so disillusioned and they're so unmotivated because it's such an awful work environment, right? Um, so I think the point here is to not get bogged down in the metrics as much as it's always nice to be able to give metrics and sell metrics and it's catchy and it's the 80 100 principle, right? um, but I think ultimately what it is sitting around the table with your employees and saying, right, guys, what is it about our work environment, the rules we've got in place, the policies, the way we manage that make us either productive or unproductive? What are our most productive days? When do we make the most sales? When do we make the least amount of sales? Um, and often it comes down to companies not even having the answers. So they start collecting the data. And I know the data people out there would love this, but a lot of companies don't keep those metrics. And when we were asked to start giving those metrics to the research bodies, we were like, okay, I can't tell you how many productive hours I have in the week. I can't. And if you ask a company that again, they might say, well, I'm not 100% sure. How much time is wasted in meetings, for example? And I bet you most of the employees out there will say, oh my God, we waste so much time in meetings, useless meetings, waste of time, nothing is achieved. Or people going outside onto the balcony to smoke or to in South Africa we'd say to Skinner to talk about the scandals and whatever. Um, and people simply sitting at their desks scrolling social media because they hate their boss and they wish there was somebody somewhere else. So, and this points to a whole lot of symptoms that are indicative of what the underlying culture is. And you're not going to be able to change that overnight by any means. This is not a quick fix, but it's a means to an end. So when you start considering, oh, maybe we should implement the 4-day week, that's not the beginning and the end of it. That's just the start, because you now have to start getting your household in order and saying, okay, let's start looking. Actually, Friday afternoons are a complete waste of time. We never make any sales. We never have any meetings. People have usually clocked off by 2, 3 o'clock. They've gone off early. They've gone to play golf, whatever. And so actually Friday afternoons are a waste of time. Or maybe it's our most productive time of the week, and that's when we close all our deals. And it's not always that easy. I understand that in industries where people sell their hours, they're an hours-based consulting firm. My husband's one of them. You can only bill the client on the hours you have spent on the job, right? So how do you, in that case, reduce that by to 80% and still get 100% of the fees in? That's trickier. I get it. I get it. But it's not to say it's impossible, right? So it's being creative. And why wouldn't you want to do that? Because when people realize that they are still being paid the same, but their workplace is improving and they are more productive, and that's really so encouraging and motivating, and everyone's in on it and everyone's excited, and yet they're still growing the company, they're still and people say, I don't think that's possible. Well, look at all the other pilot programs that have been done around the world. You can look at New Zealand, they've done the UK, they've done the US, and the metrics are there. It seems impossible, but yes, people are doing better. They've got less attrition. People are not quitting as much. They've got less, fewer sick days. They're still bringing in the business. In many cases, they grew. In many cases, they launched new products because they actually worked so well together. Anyway, it's not all, sunflowers and rainbows. Yes, it can be challenging, and it may not be ideal for certain industries. Manufacturing is tricky, right? How do you produce the same number of widgets in 80% of the time? Does it require automation? Maybe automation requires, that involves job losses. So I'm not saying it's cut and dry, but if companies take on that approach of we can do this better, that's a great place to start.
I see. I love book, for example, the 7-day weekend, right? Um,
Mm, sounds
uh,
good.
so it's by what's his name? Semco. It's Ricardo Semco. It's about, but the whole principle of how the company is now organized is completely
Mm,
different. So,
mm, mm,
like horizontal organizations, that's I think has a lot of potential.
mm-hmm,
So to me, it has a lot more to do with trust, craftsmanship, autonomy, um, and probably in total well-being, right? So that if you, as a manager, if that job is really actually necessary, um, as an owner, entrepreneur, are looking for the well-being and really asking questions about how would you love to work, right? How would you feel that you work in a way that makes you happy, instead of just
Mhm.
how would you like to work where you become more productive, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
Is that is what I'm thinking about. So that's for me actually is the same behind the inner development goal.
It's
So
exactly what I was thinking. It's, whether you apply, and this is why I get involved in these things, because I always end up with the same conclusions. Whether you go about it via the 4-day week, which suits some people, and it's a good way to get into corporates, or you go about it via the IDGs or via positive intelligence or any of the other sort of models, and there are many. It's by no means limited. It's horses for courses. It's finding the right way in where you can open that door, as you and I were kind of talking about earlier. And so the 4-day week may just be the way in, because you let the light in. As soon as you can open that door, or in some analogies, it's like making cracks in the existing setup and letting the light in, or those are the cracks are where the gold is. It's all of those analogies. Um, Sometimes that very first step uh, is what's going to set off this momentum and set off a process. And as we know, it all starts inside. Inner change leads to outer change. And if you can work with the managers and get them to really see it and understand it, as you say, whether it's through the 4-day week or inner development goals or something else, that you plant that seed, you prepare the soil, you plant that seed, and then it tends to take on a life of its own as that seed germinates and becomes something. And then maybe as a coach or a consultant, your job is to keep watering that and making sure that you're exposing it to the right amount of light and nutrition. That's why it's so great to be a coach or a consultant, is that you can then have that role in bringing that new reality to life. And it started with something often very, very small. That's sometimes what it takes, a conversation. That's why I love conversations. That's why I'm in communication. Um, but companies don't realize sometimes, they want something, they want to get an HR specialist in, or they want to get a productivity specialist in. They don't realize that to get a communications person in, they say, no, 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 our marketing is sorted. We've got a marketing division that deals with that. And for me, that's why sometimes wording can get in the way. It's like, no, that's not the communications I want to work with you on. I want to look at, what are you saying? What kind of environment do people have a voice to speak, and are you really listening? And these are sometimes really hard conversations to have. Easier one-on-one when it's just you and the leader, like you and I are having now. It's easier to be vulnerable. It's easier to share. And vulnerability is what we need in leaders these days. Gone are the times when leaders were expected to have all the answers and to be specialists in everything. Now leaders have a totally different role, or they certainly should. And it's our job to help them evolve and take on the inner development that allows them to become better leaders and to create a better, more nurturing workplace. So yeah, that's the joy of doing what we do. And that for me, that's why I'm not into mass production of what I do. Often it happens very organically through word of mouth. One client might recommend me to somebody else because of their experience. And I feel that sometimes when there's less resistance, there's more chance that you're going to meet with success. I don't want to be banging on people's doors and them saying, no, go away, we're not interested. That's a waste of my time. Yeah, I guess there's got to be a certain level of receptivity and yeah.
Julia,
Yes,
we can talk
for
forever,
hours.
yeah, for a long
Mm.
time.
Mm.
But I'm going to end it here.
Mm.
I think it was really interesting to learn about um, how you, from your perspective, in South Africa look at the IDGs and how you feel that you could use well, the indigenous voices, but also the elderly, the Ubuntu ideas into next to the IDGs. The route that Africa is still on, the development that's really going fast, at the same time looking at the results that happened in the Western world with growing so fast, to see if we can use that experience. Not we, yeah, maybe just we in total, use that experience and make that better. And also beautiful how this came together with the 4-day weekend, connected again with the IDGs as a total circle in the end. So thank you for that.
Oh, it's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. Maybe you and I can set up a talk another time and continue the conversation, because I'm sure you've got a lot to add as well. And I think this is where putting it out there, sharing these thoughts and these words, it does affect the collective consciousness, whether we realize it or not. And it's amazing how it sets off um, other activities and gets people thinking. And you never know what kind of an influence you might have, but it's truly important to have these conversations. And I think what you do with your podcast is really valuable. I'm a huge believer in it. And there are some such amazing podcasts out there. And people do need to take the time to listen, because it can be very eye-opening. So well done for that. And I hope we keep our conversations going.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think what's to come is going to be really interesting, and hopefully really positive if we can, 3.5% is what we need to convert to get a regime change. It's not that much, so got to keep going.
Thank you, Julia.
Pleasure. Thanks, Erno.